everybody, to our sixth part in our ongoing series, taking a look at the gospel according to Mark, as we're getting to journey with Jesus, getting to know who Jesus is, and along the way, I hope, who we are as well. When we last left the story of Jesus, we saw two big episodes in chapter 5 when Jesus had gone to the far side of the Sea of Galilee to Gentile territory and heals a man who's possessed by a whole legion of spirits. He comes back to his own people, to Jewish community on the other side, and heals both the synagogue leader Jairus' daughter, raises her to life, and a woman who had had a hemorrhage for 12 years has been healed at the same time. So right on the heels of all of that, we enter into chapter 6, and Mark connects it with a story that starts here. This is going to be verse 1 through 6 of chapter 6 of Mark's Gospel. It goes like this. He left that place and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. On the Sabbath, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astounded. They said, "Where did this man get all this? With what wisdom has been given to him? What deeds of power are being done in his hands? Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, and the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" And they took offense at him. Then Jesus said to them, "Prophets are not without honor, except in their hometown, and among their own kin, and in their own house." And he could do no deed of power there, except that he's laid his hands on a few sick people and cured them. And he was amazed at their unbelief. So this is a pretty abrupt transition here in these opening verses of chapter 6, because we've seen so far a lot of people who see Jesus do amazing things, and their response is something important, something amazing has happened. The evil spirits and the voice of God earlier in the gospel acknowledge this is God's Son, this is the Holy One of God, this is the Christ that the people of Israel have been waiting for. But the people who know Jesus theoretically best is his own family and neighbors, the people who've grown up with him. They don't recognize him. That seems to be one of the tensions in Mark's gospel. The people who you might expect to understand who Jesus is are the ones who are most clueless. And meanwhile, it's sick people and evil spirits, and later on we'll find some other surprising folks who recognize who Jesus is. So a couple other things that maybe we should notice here about this opening scene in the sixth chapter. There's a parallel kind of story that Luke's gospel tells when Jesus has his sort of first sermon, you could say, in his hometown synagogue in Nazareth. And there's other details that Luke records, but what's interesting is in both scenes, Jesus goes to his hometown where you might expect everybody's like, local boy does the town proud. Instead, there's this sort of confusion about who is this guy and where does he get the authority, or where does he think he gets off telling us things about God? We're the ones who changed the diaper, we're the ones who raised him, we know where he came from, that kind of thing. In Luke's gospel, the crowd is all excited about seeing their hometown boy do well until Jesus goes on to say in that opening message in Luke chapter 4 that God's love includes other people that they didn't want to allow it to include. Jesus then goes on this whole sort of side sermon about how in the past God's love had included Gentiles and outsiders and not good enough people, and that was sort of God's way of doing things all along. So if the people of Nazareth were upset that Jesus was reaching out and sharing God's power and healing and blessing to other people, to outsiders, they should get along, they should get with the program. This is how God has always done things. We're not exactly sure if that's part of the content that Mark's telling for us, or if it's just that these people are like, where's this guy getting this from? We grew up with him, we know him, and now where does he get off telling us stuff about God? But interestingly enough, this crowd that should be a sympathetic, supportive, listening audience is instead upset with him. And we've seen this tension already in Mark's gospel, haven't we? Where Jesus' biological family shows up, his mother and brothers and sisters, and they want to see Jesus at one point because they think he's gone crazy, and they want to prevent him from scandalizing the family any further. And Jesus' response earlier had been, who are my mother and brothers and sisters? Whoever does the will of God. We talked about how Jesus sort of creates a found family, this new kind of community that isn't bound by biology. And again, it seems like there's threads of that here. What Jesus is up to is not just creating a community where he does good for people who are like him, or Jesus is only there to help his own hometown or his own people or his own group, but Jesus is creating a new kind of community that, sure, is open to people from his hometown, but also includes people from farther away. Not only other Jewish areas around Galilee, but as we've seen already, Jesus has this way of reaching across boundaries to include those people, those outsiders, those Gentiles, and sinners and tax collectors, all the people who you put out of bounds, Jesus has this way of including. Now, another interesting detail that Mark gives us that we just need to let sort of sit with us. When Jesus sees or is confronted with this sort of disbelief in his own hometown, and the people are like, who is this guy? Don't we know his family? He grew up here. He graduated with me, that kind of thing. Mark says Jesus could do no deed of power. Jesus was unable to do any deed of power, except he healed a couple of people, as though those miracles are, well, just those tiny miracles. But okay, Jesus could do no deed of power. This is an interesting thing, because other gospel writers who were probably using a copy of Mark when they wrote. For example, Matthew probably has a copy of Mark in front of him when he wrote the gospel we call Matthew's gospel. When he tells the same scene, he says Jesus wouldn't do or didn't do any deeds of power, but doesn't make it sound like he couldn't. Probably because Matthew's worried that if we hear couldn't, that's going to sound like Jesus, was there something he couldn't do, that he wasn't powerful enough or something like that. He's worried we'll mishear it as Jesus isn't really the divine Son of God or something. Mark is willing to leave things kind of messy and unresolved. He just puts it out there. Jesus couldn't do miracles there because of their unbelief. And he kind of leaves that lack of resolution. Like, it doesn't really mean it doesn't mean that he's not the Messiah, but it means that, the distrust, the lack of faith in him means he couldn't do anything in that place, except, as Mark notes, he healed a few people. This is, again, one of those tensions that I hope we're seeing in the gospel. That Jesus is both fully human and at the very same time has the very power of the God of Israel. But there's something strikingly human about when Jesus meets with rejection. He is limited, and he doesn't do miracles, and Mark is willing to just leave it at he couldn't do them there. Also, I want us to note Jesus' response when he meets with what at best is kind of standoffish, kind of shrugging off by his friends and neighbors back in Nazareth, and at worst is kind of a rejection. That Jesus doesn't get mad and call fire down to destroy these people who've rejected him. Jesus just sort of moves on to the next. Okay, you're not interested, fine. I'll move on. But that Jesus doesn't burn bridges from his side, but also doesn't return violence for violence or say, fine, you don't do, you didn't accept me, I'll destroy you. Jesus doesn't become spiteful. That's going to become important because later when Jesus sends out his own disciples, it's going to be with the same pattern. Sometimes you're going to run into people who welcome you, great. Sometimes you're going to run into people who won't receive you. Don't get mean about it. Don't get bitter or fussy or angry. Okay, you've made the invitation. You've offered what you could offer. If people reject it, just keep moving on. That's part of our witness too. That the way we respond to hostility isn't that we answer evil with evil or meanness with meanness. In a sense, this is a really important piece of what both the message and the way of Jesus looks like. That when we run into people who are not interested or who are hostile or don't want to respond to Jesus at the moment, it can be really tempting to sort of dig our heels in and get mad back at them or be forceful. We need to make you do what I want. You need to do what I say. And Jesus' way is no, we're not going to be coercive. We're not going to be bitter. We're not going to be vengeful. It's grace. Grace even when being rejected. That's a pretty powerful thing. And in fact, that is a part of the witness, I think, about what the way of Jesus looks like. And that's what sort of spurs on the next scene we're going to take a look at, where Jesus gathers the disciples to send them out to be his agents in the wider community. chapter continues, and the next chunk of the chapter goes through about verse 13. And it goes like this. Then he went among the villages teaching. He called the 12 and began to send them out 2 by 2 and gave them authority over the unclean spirits. He ordered them to take nothing for their journey except a staff, no bread, no bag, no money in their belts, but to wear sandals and not to put on 2 tunics. He said to them, "Wherever you enter a house, stay there until you leave the place. If any will not welcome you, and they refuse to hear you, as you leave, shake the dust off that place on your feet as a testimony against them." So they went out and proclaimed that all should repent. They cast out many demons and anointed with oil many who were sick and cured them. Now that kind of leaves that sending out of the disciples sort of with a to be continued. Like this sort of feels like the end of an episode, and the ... and the next episode will pick up with what happens with the disciples, because Mark is going to do something funny with his timeline in the next section. We're going to get an actual honest to goodness flashback in the Gospels. But here, let's watch the momentum here. Jesus goes to his hometown, is there to preach, is there to do what he's done in other places, in words and in actions, embody what God's reign looks like. And because of the rejection he's met with, he can't or doesn't do much as far as big miracles, big signs, big wonders. He heals some people, but their unbelief becomes this obstacle. Well, okay, that doesn't stop the kingdom from coming. It doesn't stop the reign of God from happening. But when the reign of God meets with that kind of opposition, instead of digging its heels and no, I'm going to make you do it. No, okay, I'll go elsewhere. Fine. It just sort of it finds a way. Almost like when you watch like a creek bed that's gone dry, and the first rain comes down, and you can sort of watch the water sort of make its own course and wind its way around. Or you take a look at a small creek, in someone's farm or in alongside the road somewhere, and you can sort of see where the creek has just sort of bent and curved, or maybe it ran into an obstacle or a rock or something like that. You can't stop the water; it just moves around and just keeps on going. Something like that is how the reign of God works, as Jesus shows it to us here. And now, Jesus takes the 12, who he'd already sort of set apart to be like this sort of symbolic new embodiment of Israel, a new way of being Israel. The number 12, we said before, was sort of a callback to the 12 tribes of Israel. Like in American culture, 13 is sort of a callback to the 13 colonies, or the number 1776 is a callback to the War of Independence, that kind of thing. 12 is one of those numbers for ancient Israel and for Jesus. So he sends out his disciples in small pairs, in groups of 2, and they go to the surrounding towns to do what Jesus had been doing, right? They are empowered to speak, to say the message Jesus had spoken. So way at the beginning, we got what the one-sentence summary of Jesus' message is: the reign of God has come near. Turn around, you can be a part of it right here, right now. That's the good news to believe. So Jesus sends his disciples, go, announce that message. Turn around, the kingdom of God is right here. You can be a part of it. And he empowers the disciples to speak with the same authority he has. We've seen all along the way how Jesus has a certain authority that the evil spirits don't contest, that the elements, the wind and the waves and the storm can't protest against. Jesus just speaks with this authority, and everybody seems to recognize Jesus teaches with authority, he speaks, he heals people with divine authority. Now he's conferred that on the disciples and says, you go out and do the same things I've done in all these different places around. But they go vulnerably. They don't go marching in saying, we're the new law and order here in this town. They don't do this in a way that makes themselves rich. They aren't there to collect donations from people to make themselves or their cause richer. They aren't there to get themselves connected with political power. They are there to basically to bring people more fully to life. Where are there people who need healing? Where are there people who need to be set free from the powers of evil? Where are there people who need to hear the good news that God's reign is coming near? They do that. They bring those things, and then they move on to the next town. And when they meet with rejection, Jesus gives them the same model that he had just shown in Nazareth. When you meet with rejection, okay, I'll move on to the next place. Sort of the course of the creek, the course of the riverbed, it just sort of moves around the obstacle and keeps on going. Mark's not a dummy. Mark is intentional with the way he gives us stories. So we first got Jesus meeting with rejection in Nazareth, and now here's how Jesus prepares his disciples to go out to do what he's done, and Jesus telling them Go vulnerably, go empty-handed, and trust that God will provide for your needs through other people, and go ready to be rejected. That if somebody comes along and says they don't want your message, they won't receive you, just the most you can do, shake the dust off your sandals and say, fine, I'll go somewhere else. But you don't call down fire from heaven. You don't get in a fist fight. You don't get angry. You don't say, I'm taking this back, it's ours, and we're gonna fight to make you receive us. No, okay, rejection, fine. We move on to the next place, and the reign of God continues. The parade continues as it moves along down the road. That, in and of itself, is an important part of what the reign of God looks like. There's a certain vulnerability, an openness to being rejected that's a part of how God's love works, rather than coercion, rather than, I'm going to make you do what I want, and if you don't, I'm going to force it. There's a willingness for God to be rejected, a willingness for God to face that being vulnerable. And the followers of Jesus are sent with that kind of vulnerability as well. That's a part of how our mission in the world is supposed to look as well. Rather than thinking we need to make everybody do what we want or make everybody agree with us, we're called to bring this message of Jesus into the wider world. And there are going to be some who are super excited about it. There will be some who take a little bit of time warming up to see if we find that our walk matches our talk. And there will be some who just don't want to have anything to do with it. And it doesn't mean we give up on people, but it doesn't mean that we get to force other people to do what we want, or that we should force other people to give us a special privileged kind of position. That's the next important piece about the sending out the disciples. Now, remember, because we're about to have a flashback, remember that when we're leaving our heroes, the 12 disciples, they're scattered out to all the different towns around, and they're going to come back in a little bit after a strange sort of an interlude. So as the story continues, Mark is, I don't know how to describe it. It's sort of like watching a master juggler who's got 3 or 4 different bowling pins or chainsaws in the air at any given time, and Mark is keeping track of a whole bunch of them, or sort of like somebody who works with thread, a knitter or crocheter, or somebody who's good at weaving, and how they take a whole bunch of different strands and are able to bring them together, some to the front now and some to the back, to sort of hold things together. Mark does that in a way that I don't know that we appreciate unless you watch how he does it through the whole story. So I hope that's something that you're able to catch along and see as we go along even further, how Mark is doing a lot more than just throwing out a whole bunch of stories he's heard. There's intentional arrangement and there's meaning to be found as one thing leads to another. So I hope what you'll see along the way is Mark telling a bigger picture that's made up of strands of individual episodes, but how one kind of flows into the next, into the next, into the next. Kind of like the line drawings here on the wall, how one pattern sort of blurs into the next and then brings back this, and this idea, this motif sort of comes back along the way. We're hopefully seeing that along the way, in big ways as well as in little ways. So the idea we saw just a little bit ago, Jesus kind of models how to go someplace to bring the news of the kingdom, to heal, and in words and in actions embody the reign of God. And then he also embodies how to be rejected, basically, how to deal with when you're rejected. And then we get the story of Jesus sending his disciples out. Well, okay, now Mark kind of sticks a pin in that. And at first you might wonder, what's going on here? Why are we about to have this flashback? We're going to come back to the disciples, but see if you can catch part of what's going on here, why we're about to flash back and then pick up with the story as we continue on. So this continues in verses 14 through 29 of chapter 6. It goes like this. King Herod heard of it, and Jesus' name had become known. Some were saying, John the Baptizer has been raised from the dead, and for this reason these powers are at work in him. But others said, it is Elijah. And others said, it's a prophet like one of the prophets of old. But when Herod heard of it, he said, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised. For Herod himself had sent men who arrested John, bound him, and put him in prison on account of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because Herod had married her. For John had been telling Herod, "It's not lawful for you to have your brother's wife." And Herodias had a grudge against him and wanted to kill him. But she could not, for Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and protected him. When he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet he liked to listen to him. But an opportunity came when Herod, on his birthday, gave a banquet for courtiers and officers for the leaders of Galilee. When his daughter Herodias came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his guests. And the king said to the girl, "Ask me for whatever you wish, and I shall give it." And he solemnly swore to her, "Whatever you ask me, I will give you, even half my kingdom." She went out and said to her mother, "What should I ask for?" She replied, "The head of John the Baptizer." Immediately she rushed back to the king and requested, "I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptizer on a platter." The king was deeply grieved, yet out of regard for his oaths and for the guests, he did not want to refuse her. Immediately the king sent a soldier of the guard with orders to bring John's head. He went and beheaded him in the prison, brought his head on a platter, and gave it to the girl. Then the girl gave it to her mother. When his disciples heard about it, they came and took his body and laid it in a tomb. Okay, that's a weird story on so many levels, right? I mean, like, number one, it breaks the timeline. We're hearing stories about Jesus, and there's this weird interlude. Herod has heard about Jesus, and Herod's assumption is, oh my goodness, John the Baptist, who I killed, is back from the dead. And then that stops Mark to go, oh, I didn't tell you the story about how John the Baptist died. Let me go back and tell you that story. That's weird by itself. On top of that, this is a pretty gory story in what so far has been like a PG rated story so far. Why all the gore all of a sudden, and why hear it now? And maybe we could also explore a little bit about like how we get such a villainous turn from King Herod, who we haven't really heard from almost at all in this whole story so far. We talked before about how Mark doesn't give us a birth story of Jesus. We don't get the Magi going, following the star, and visiting King Herod. Probably the earlier King Herod the Great. This is the son probably in this scene. We don't get manger shepherds or anything like that. There's no really introduction earlier to Herod, who is a Roman puppet king, sort of placed to rule over part of this territory. And here's our introduction to him. It's strange, right? And then on top of that, there's just the sheer cowardice, I guess, of Herod. I mean, there's a cruelty here, but it's also sort of he doesn't want to kill John because he knows that's trouble. But when his stepdaughter requests the head of John the Baptizer, he doesn't want to look bad in front of all the party guests, and so he's willing to kill John because he doesn't want to look bad. I mean, it's basically just cowardice, and he doesn't want to be exposed as a fraud. So Herod has been all big talk, and finally, when push comes to shove, okay, I'll kill John if it will help me save face, even though he knows it's wrong. Herod sort of comes off as this sort of slimy, arrogant buffoon, who is willing to be cruel if it's expedient. In some ways, he's like the opposite of who Jesus embodies what the reign of God is supposed to look like, which is kind of important, sort of in a subtle way, because Herod's title, in a sense, is king of Judea, of the Jews. He's sort of a king. He could call himself king of the Jews, even though he's placed by the Romans like a puppet, and he's kind of vaguely half Jewish. That's another story for another day. And yet here comes Jesus, who will later be acclaimed king of the Jews, and the way he reigns is like the opposite of Herod. Instead of being willing to kill other people when it's expedient, Jesus is willing to die in a very costly way. Instead of being, arrogant and brash, Jesus is willing simply to let his actions speak, and he doesn't have to brag or talk about how great he thinks he is at all. So there's some of that contrast going on too. The other thing I think maybe going on for Mark as he tells us this story now in this moment is to help us see, again, a parallel between this is what happens if you are a holy troublemaker, and this is sort of where Mark is headed. To be a part of the reign of God is going to rub up against those who are powerful in the world's sense of power, right? The empires, the Herods, the Caesars, the Pontius Pilates, they rule in a very different kind of a way. When they run into opposition, they crush it. When they run into something that makes them look bad, they deny it or destroy the evidence or get rid of the people who say things that are uncomfortable. And Jesus brings a very different way of dealing with the world, but that exposes, kind of like in the Emperor's New Clothes story, if you're the little kid saying the Emperor's naked, the emperor is going to do everything possible to shut that down. You don't want people finding out the emperor is naked. And the true prophets in Israel's story, going all the way back to the Elijahs and Elishas and Isaiahs and Jeremiahs, all the way up to John the Baptizer. And Jesus, in some sense, owns that role and title of prophet, even if we say he is more than a prophet. There's to all of them a sense of being holy troublemakers, of people who aren't there just to rubber stamp whatever the king or the powerful people or the religious people say, but they're there to speak this alternative word from God, especially from underneath, from the without a position of privilege or power. That often cost the prophets their lives or their livelihoods or their physical comfort, and John's story is no different. You might remember also, way back in the first chapter of Mark's Gospel, the moment that kickstarts Jesus' public ministry is when John's arrested. Remember, at the very beginning, when Jesus is baptized, he goes out into the wilderness, and the next thing we hear is when John was arrested, Jesus then begins his ministry, basically taking up the message that John had sort of prepared things for. The reign of God has come near. Turn, you can be a part of it. Believe that good news. Jesus does that when he realizes John's now in prison. He can't do it. The torch has been passed to me. It's time to be a holy troublemaker in a new way, but continuing on in that same vein. And so now we've just heard Jesus take his disciples and say, now you all go out. But as a reminder, this isn't going to be all unicorns and rainbows. It's not going to be everything coming up roses. There's opposition. The powers of the day, the powers of the world will be opposed to the reign of God that doesn't have to use coercion and doesn't have to use bluster and doesn't use violence or force to come, but is willing to be vulnerable and rejectable. That the empire doesn't like that. Herod doesn't like that. So here's a reminder. These are the stakes. To be a part of the way of Jesus is going to mean conflict with the powers of the day. The political powers, the respectable religious powers. Remember, they're collaborating already. The Pharisees and the scribes are collaborating with the Herodians, looking for ways to get rid of Jesus. But here we've got this sort of interlude to remind us, here are the stakes. To be a part of the kingdom of God, the reign of God, that both Jesus and John the Baptizer are a part of, and now the disciples are a part of. It's going to mean opposition. So we need this story almost as an interlude to remind us, just like Jesus began his ministry when John was arrested, now Jesus' disciples are sent out at the point where John is beheaded. And there's always that shadow sort of in the background. There's also like sort of the foreshadowing, you could say, of where the story of Jesus is going to go. The last thing we hear about John is his disciples come and take his body and bury it in a tomb. And again, sort of foreshadowing, like, okay, this is the path. This is where things are going to go. This story of Jesus is going to end with death. I mean, we aren't yet to hearing it's going to be a cross yet, but it's going to be a cross. And Mark is going to start doing things in the next couple of chapters to sort of get us ready for not only is there a cross coming, but there's the hope of resurrection. Even though the disciples aren't going to be ready to understand it yet. But with resurrection coming, there's going to be this contrast where John's story gets to death, and the last thing you can say about John is he's buried in a tomb. Jesus then becomes this one who, dies. His disciples will bury him in a borrowed grave. But that's not going to be the end. Mark is already setting the table for that and getting us ready for that, laying down themes that later he's going to draw on here in the way he does his storytelling here. It's masterful. It really is sort of like watching a master, like knitter or someone who's weaving, like take all the different threads and say, yeah, you thought I dropped this. Nope, it's going to come back here. Or like listening to a composer's symphony who takes melodies and themes from the first movement and brings them back in the fourth movement, that kind of thing. Mark is doing that too. And again, we don't always recognize that the sheer genius, the insight and ideas that as a storyteller Mark is giving to us just in the way he connects dots for us and arranges the stories that he gives us. There's a lot going on here that's more than just here's a handful of stories and dumping them. There's art and there's design, and he's saying something even in just the way he's arranged them. So we'll see that as we pick up now and see what happens with the disciples while they've been scattered to the different towns. Our story picks up then with verse 30, and it goes in sort of a long piece that goes through verse 44 and moves us into a story that's pretty familiar to a lot of people, where Jesus feeds a multitude. The story continues like this, beginning in verse 30. The apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all they had done and taught. He said to them, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a deserted place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they hurried there on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. As he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. When it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now very late. Send them away, so that they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy something for themselves to eat." But he answered them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Are we to go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give that to them to eat?" And he said to them, "How many loaves have you? Go and see." When they had found out, they said, 5, and 2 fish. He ordered them to get all the people to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and of 50s. Taking the loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to his disciples and set them before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them as well. And all ate and were filled. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. Those who had eaten the loaves numbered 5,000 men. Okay, before we get to that story we call the feeding of the 5,000, that's easily one of the most well-known miracle stories. It's the one miracle that is recorded in all 4 Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all give us that story. Aside from the resurrection, that's the only one that all 4 tell. Interesting. But before we get there, this is sort of how the scattered disciples who'd gone to the different towns sort of get brought back together. We had that weird flashback going back to the story of John the Baptizer as sort of a reminder in the background. To be a part of Jesus' movement is going to mean you're going to run into trouble with the powerful, the Herods, the Pontius Pilates, the Caesars, the empire. That Jesus brings God's reign, and that's the other claimers of power are not going to like that. So the disciples sort of get back together, and Jesus wants to have a chance sort of to process what's happened with them, and they're going to go off to a deserted place. They get in the boat, they're going to go across to another spot along the Sea of Galilee. And remember, this is a pretty good-sized lake. The Sea of Galilee is a lake. It's about 64 square miles. And so you could find lots of different corners and still be in your territory. This isn't going to be like going across to Gentile territory that was so clearly Gentile territory earlier when you get a guy who's near a whole herd of pigs. This is just sort of, we're going to go find an empty spot where there's nowhere to go, nowhere nobody else is going to bother us, and we're going to have some chance to talk. Well, the crowds, of course, can see, oh, I think they're sailing over there, and they go walk on foot and meet them there. And when Jesus gets and sees all these people have come, and they have this need, they're looking to him, Jesus' response is compassion, and the compassion takes the form, interestingly, of healing. Other times it's been Jesus sees their need and he sees that they're bringing their sick, and so he would heal them. Here this moment is they need guidance, they need to hear a word from God. So Jesus starts teaching, and the day goes on. Preachers have a way of letting time get away from them. And the disciples say, "Send everybody away." And Jesus' response is interesting. You give them something. The disciples at this point are like, "Okay, Jesus, we don't have your miraculous power here. We have to use money. So 200 denarii, that's, the rough back of the envelope math is a denarius is what you get paid for one day's labor at minimum wage in the ancient world in this time. So 200 days has got to be, a little more than half a year's salary on minimum wage. So a pretty sizable amount that nobody's going to be carrying in their wallet that day. And Jesus says, "Well, go see, show me what you got." And of course, the answer comes back. We got 5 little loaves and 2 fish. And not only is this a story about how Jesus takes what is not enough and makes abundance, but Mark is also laying the groundwork for another important moment where Jesus is going to take bread in a moment. So pay attention to the order and the specificity of the words. Jesus takes the bread, blesses the bread, breaks the bread, and gives the bread. That's the order, those are the words. There's going to come a moment on the night in which Jesus is betrayed, when Jesus takes the bread and blesses the bread and breaks the bread and gives the bread and feeds his disciples on the night of his betrayal, on what we now call the Lord's Supper, or the Last Supper that he has with them. Now, Mark doesn't do any more connecting of the dots. When we get to the Last Supper at the end of the Gospel, he doesn't say, hey, this is exactly like what happened back with the feeding of the 5,000. He trusts that we've been paying attention, that we're going to hear echoes here. But pay attention now. Notice that that's the wording, because that's going to come back later on. Other Gospel writers play that up even more. And like Luke, for example, tells that famous story after the resurrection, when Jesus is revealed in the breaking of the bread, because there in Emmaus, he takes the bread, blesses the bread, breaks the bread, gives the bread, and everybody recognizes it's Jesus. Mark is a little more subtle, I'll say, and he doesn't give us the after Easter stories that other gospel writers do. But notice the connection here now. He takes the bread, blesses the bread, breaks the bread, gives the bread. And just in that chain, we're going to see another connection later on. Also notice how there's this way of Jesus taking scarcity and breaking open the situation and what is clearly, by any account, not enough, not adequate, and making it into what is not just adequate but more than enough. In a way, that's what Jesus is doing with the disciples themselves, right? We've seen so far the disciples are a mixed bag as far as how well they get it, right? There are times when they're, okay, Jesus, I'll follow you, and then there's times where they see him do something that only God can do, and they're left scratching their head going, I don't know what to make of this. Who is this guy? We're going to see, as the chapters unfold here, the disciples continue to struggle both with understanding who Jesus is and what his reign as Messiah, as Son of God, means, what it looks like for him to be the Christ. They're going to be fighting with each other about who's greatest and how to be great in the kingdom of God. So they're going to continue to struggle. And yet, despite all the ways they are disqualified, all the ways they don't get it or miss it or are dense and selfish and sometimes can be real jerks, Jesus uses them and takes what is inadequate and makes abundance. So, and again, it's the miracle is a story about a miracle. It's a story about how somehow 5 crumbly little barley loaves and 2 little fishes feed a crowd of thousands. And yet it's also about, this is what happens where Jesus shows up. What is clearly not enough gets transformed into something that feeds all in an abundance. Even to the point that there are 12 baskets of leftovers at the end of this scene. Which, in an era where there aren't refrigerators, and there isn't Tupperware, and there isn't even saran wrap to plastic wrap things, you have to figure that got gathered up to be given away. I mean, Jesus is not traveling around with a refrigerator. He doesn't have a home base where you can say, well, all right, well, we'll store this back at home and we'll all eat this later. There's all this abundance that you have to figure got shared with other people who didn't even come out there to the party that day on the hillside, or that was given to those people as they went home. There's abundance not just for the moment, but even for the people who weren't at the party, even for the people who didn't come, even for the people who didn't bother following Jesus out into that deserted place, there's that kind of abundance. That's what happens where the reign of God happens. That God's goodness spills over beyond any boundaries we try and contain it with. Almost like that line from Psalm 23 about your cup overflowing. There's such abundance, it overflows the container. Even though there's 12 baskets of leftovers sitting there as sort of witnesses of God's power in this moment. So, all that said, the scene ends with everybody being astonished at what Jesus has just done and just sort of leaving it hanging. There was at least 5,000 men who'd been fed, and imagining that certainly could have meant whole households, whole families went out. So some estimate we could be talking about a crowd easily double or triple that if you've got wives and children coming along as well. But easily, this is thousands and thousands of people who have come to listen to Jesus and weren't expecting a meal, but now are fed. And that's going to send sort of shock waves throughout the rest of the story as people now see Jesus as somebody who can feed them, and it's possible that they will want to abuse or misunderstand that. But that begins to send shock waves out in the story itself. We'll pick up next with what happens after that. So the scene continues with another miracle upon a miracle. And I'm going to ask us to follow along to the end of the chapter, and we'll see there's a couple of little episodes, but they all kind of fit together. Beginning in verse 45 and then running to the end of the chapter, verse 56. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side to Bethsaida, where he dismissed the crowd. After saying farewell to them, he went up on the mountain to pray. When evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. When he saw that they were straining at the oars against an adverse wind, he came toward them early in the morning, walking on the sea. He intended to pass them by, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost, and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. And they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. When they had crossed over, they came to land at Gennesaret and moored the boat. When they got out of the boat, people at once recognized him and rushed about that whole region, began to bring the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, into villages or cities or farms, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and begged him that they might touch even the fringe of his cloak. And all who touched it were healed. Okay, so again, Mark has used sort of a geographical movement to end one episode and move to another. So we've had this feeding of the 5,000, and once everybody's eaten and there's all these leftovers, and Jesus is like, all right, time to get out of here. He sends his disciples. They get on the boat. They've been using this boat a lot. All right, you guys go on ahead. I'm going to hang back and send the crowds home now that we've fed them. And then his plan is to go up on the mountain to pray. Notice, another thread of continuity, right? So this strand that we've had up here, Jesus will often go off by himself to go and pray, get clarity. What's the next plan? What am I doing next? To get recentered on who I am, what's the mission, how am I supposed to carry out God's will next? And he's going to do that again, go up on the mountain to pray. And when Jesus comes down, he sees, you can see on the lake, the Sea of Galilee kind of sits like the bottom of a bowl or a basin, and all around there are hills sloping all around it. And so from about wherever you are, you can look down in, and if you know your guys in your boat, you'll recognize them. Yeah, you could see, boy, they're not making the headway I would expect. And again, it's a small enough body of water that you should theoretically be able to, you could see your people, oh, they're using the oars. Boy, they're having a hard time. They're struggling. And again, Mark doesn't exactly give us what's going on in Jesus' mind about why his plan is to pass them by, but that's his plan. He's going to walk on the water and he's just going to sort of walk right on past them, but they spot Jesus, and when they see him, their immediate reaction is, we're afraid. Jesus sees their fear and responds to that fear to calm it. And his response, in English, "It is I, don't be afraid," has even more heft to it in Mark's Greek. The way you say "it is I" in Greek comes out literally as "I am," which you might have some bells ringing there. That's the name for God in the Old Testament in Hebrew. The name Yahweh comes from the Hebrew verb to be, I am. So that famous story where Moses asked God, "What's your name? Which God shall I say has sent me to Pharaoh?" And God's response is, "I am who I am. I will be who I will be. Tell them I am has sent you." And the Hebrew for that, Yahweh, comes from the verb I am. So God's name is being itself, sort of, I am who I am. Well, Jesus, in sort of like this winking moment, is walking out on the water, again, doing the kinds of things only God should be able to do, and speaks and says, "Don't be afraid. I am. It's me." Like one level of what he's saying is, it's me. Don't think it's a ghost. It's me. You know me. But also there's sort of this like winking. In Jesus we get no less and none other than the I am of Israel's scripture, the Yahweh of Israel's ancient memory. Mark kind of just leaves that detail hanging there. Again, he's not one to spell things out for us. Like John, when he'll tell the story, he'll say, "I don't want you to miss this. This is what I mean by this." But here, Mark just kind of leaves it there. Jesus' response, "It is I," doubles as "I am," like sort of as a wink back to God's own name. And sort of, we've seen a scene earlier where Jesus speaks to the water and the waves and calms the storm. So here where Jesus is walking on water, in a sense, it's not exactly new. We've seen Jesus do things like this before. But now he again uses that power, the authority he clearly has, the authority of the divine, I am, but he uses it to calm things. He uses it for good, for life, for bringing peace, rather than more of a storm or violence or to scold the disciples. When they get across to the other side, everybody wants to be where Jesus is. They can see where he is, and everybody just sort of flocks around him. Again, we've seen this scene play out before too, right? Jesus gets known, and everybody brings their sick, those who are troubled with evil spirits, those who are in need of comfort or good news. They flock to Jesus where he is. And so, again, Mark's bringing that thread back. He continues to grow in his reputation. Nobody's quite sure what to make of him, right? We just saw earlier, Herod is upset at this Jesus because he brings back too many memories of John the Baptizer, who Herod had tried to get rid of. We've got the religious people who are picking fights with Jesus. We've got disciples who aren't sure what to make of him, and others who just seem to think, here's somebody who might be my only hope to help my loved one or help me when I'm sick. But we're seeing this thread continue. So Mark is wanting us to see that carried along, that it's not just Jesus does a handful of miracles at once and then that's it, but that's a common thread. Wherever Jesus goes, life breaks out. That's maybe not a bad way to think of this whole section of the gospel. Wherever Jesus goes, life breaks out. So near, far, towns that he knows, towns he doesn't know, foreigners, insiders, outsiders, wherever he goes, life breaks out. And I think we're supposed to get along the way. This is what the kingdom of God looks like. So whether it's Jesus doing it or when he sends his disciples out, this is what it looks like. People get brought more fully to life where God's reign happens. And that's sort of where things land at the end of this chapter. We're going to see sort of Mark is getting ready to set up more controversy, more tension between Jesus and the respectable religious people coming up. But for now, this is sort of an end point that brings this episode to an end and brings this sort of several strands, sort of it's a good place for Mark to stick a pin in them. And we're going to see new issues raised when we get together next time. So we hope that you join us next time. We're going to be taking a look at chapter 7 for next week's study. And want to invite you as we continue along the way looking through Mark's gospel, that this isn't just a way of hearing a bunch of Bible stories or learning facts about Jesus, so much as it is being trained to walk in the way of Jesus too. And if part of our calling is to do the kinds of things, to go the kind of places where Jesus went and did, and where Jesus still leads us today, then maybe one of the questions is, where is life breaking out among us? And if we're trying to be followers of Jesus who announce the same reign of God, how can we be a part of life breaking out right around us in whatever circumstances we find ourselves? I want to ask you to think on that question, and we'll pick up with that conversation next time here in our journey with Jesus. Thanks for being with us today.